So, for that introduction. Could I just check? Can you hear at the back? If it doesn't carry, just tell me. That was delightful because it's the commitment of the University of Cumbria to the idea of the practitioner-researcher and teacher research. And it's in marked contrast to what happened last night at the University of Bath, because I've spent most of my working life in the Department of Education there. And last night, they had a gathering to commemorate 48 years of initial teacher education, which was being closed down by the university. This was a course that had an outstanding judgment at Ofsted, and the reason being given to close it was that there was a lack of fit with the strategic research-led vision of the university. Because you just bear that in mind, there was a lack of fit, and it was a lack of strategic fit with the research-led vision of the university. Now, what I'll be hoping to communicate today is the importance of the practitioner research, the teacher research, which, in my judgment, should be at the heart of a university because of the values base, which I think we're all representing in terms of the flourishing of humanity. So that's in stark contrast. Last night, big gathering, closure, initial teacher education. Today, a real celebration of practitioner research, enhancing professionalism at the University of Cumbria. And I'll just mention that it was actually 47 years ago that I was sat as an initial trainee in the library of St Martin's College in Lancaster, doing my first special study called The Way to Professionalism in Education, ? And that marked my passion for contributing to professionalism in education. And what I've done is I've actually put my keynote already on the web. So all the notes are there, the resources. I'll show you how to access it. And what I'm hoping to do today is stimulate you sufficiently to go to access, if you like, the detailed notes, but also the live URLs to the various resources that I've made available to you from practitioner researchers, different parts of the world, that I'm saying we should be recognising as master and doctor educators. So my first, if you like, focus today is to say that if we want to enhance professionalism, we really do need to focus on the kind of knowledge base that you and I can actually generate and share and make public. And that knowledge base, I would think everybody here can already claim to be master educators, and most will be already doctor educators, but nobody in this country recognises any of us as master or doctor educators. And I'm saying to enhance professionalism, we really do need to be recognised and recognise each other in those terms. It's really great the University of Cumbria have actually honoured me with that notion of the honorary professor in education. I've also been a professor that was president of the British Educational Research Association. When I look at the way I'm introduced around the world, it is never as a doctor educator. You follow, it is always the academic status which is given to a professor of education. And yet what I'm hoping to persuade you of is that we should be really seeking this recognition as master and doctor educators. And I'll try and show you how I think we can do that through the kind of inquiries that we can all undertake. But what I've done is I've actually put on the web, as I say, this keynote. And I'll just show you how you can access it, because all of my resources that I use are in a website which is just called actionresearch.net. So if you actually access actionresearch.net, you'll find that all the resources that I'm going to talk about can be already accessed from this website. So I'm hoping that you'll all go in. If you click on this, I'll come back to this. This is one of the multimedia journals that I'm saying that we can publish in. It's rather like the journal at the University of Cumbria, the Practitioner Research and Higher Education. The difference is at the moment, this one is a multimedia journal, so you can integrate your videos from your classroom practice, you can analyse those within the text. I'll show you how to access that and why I think it's so significant. But if you go into here, the right-hand column, what's new, you'll be able to access my keynote with all the resources that I'll be showing you today. On the left-hand side here, I just want to point to these, and I'll come back to them, because in these areas here, you've got living theory doctorates of what I'm calling doctor educators, and I explain to them what I mean by living theory, which I believe each one of us can create. Here we've got the master educator's writings, and then we've got pre-service. This was a tutor at the University of Bath that has produced something which I don't think has been bettered in 20 years ago, 92, 93, with our initial trainees of how they created their own living theories. And you can access all of these just by, as I say, it's just like clicking on these. You can go down. I'll show you how you can access these and why these are so significant. This one I've just put up there. It's from the University of Pretoria in South Africa, a well-known, quite conservative university, but it's the first one that's created a living theory of teaching undergraduate medical students. So you'll see how these ideas of living theory are travelling in different parts of the world. Now, I would just add that I'm very happy if there's anything that you're feeling, look, you want to interject or you want to question, I'm very happy for you to do that as we're actually going on. Because it's certainly not conducive. If you look at this tiered lecture theatre, you can't see the person behind you. So this notion of conviviality, which is so important in my understanding of education, our very space is not actually congenial to this kind of interaction, which is at the heart for me of education. So don't please, hesitate. If you feel there's something you want me to follow up with, or question, or interject, as I say, please do. And I know it's a bit difficult in this context, but I do hope you will if you feel moved to do it. What I'm going to just focus on is, as well as thanking the organisers of the RIPLE Summer Conference, because RIPLE, as the Research Institute for Professional Learning and Education, seems to me to have a really important role to play in enhancing professionalism through encouraging all of you to bring your embodied knowledge as educators into a university for accreditation in a way that doesn't distort the knowledge that you actually express in your practice. And to emphasize this, what I usually do in my keynotes around the world is to videotape the keynote and then put that at the beginning of my presentation. So tomorrow you'll be able to see the video and then compare it with the text. Because what I'm claiming is that as I'm with you now, the fact that Pete and others have offered me this opportunity to come and talk with you is literally energizing me. When you think it was 47 years ago that I started that sense of passion for professionalism, I've got this wonderful opportunity to share with you some of that learning over that time. And I'm hoping what you can sense in me and from me is an energy which is connected to the embodied values that I hope. So I really do love what I do in education, and I have done for years in terms of what I do with the masters and the doctoral students, what I do within schools. But if you compare how I'm expressing this energy and the passion with the values in the here and now with you, and then read the words on the pages of text, what I'm claiming is that there is something missing from the words on the pages of text. That as you come and bring your knowledge into the university for accreditation in master's and doctoral degrees, many of you will feel, I think, constrained by the fact that many universities still haven't changed their regulations to allow multimedia representations. And what I'm hoping to convince you of as well is that your embodied knowledge, the knowledge you express in your practice, will require some visual data to show what you're doing, because your values are embodied in who you are and what you do. And even in the here and now, being with you, I'm very conscious that I'm feeling energized. There's a passion behind what I'm saying, which cannot be communicated on the pages of text. And yet, quite a few of the doctoral researchers that I've supervised have now got into the University of Bath Library multimedia narratives, and I've made those doctorates available for you. So I do hope you'll bear that in mind, that when you're coming to bring your embodied knowledge into the academy as a master or a doctor educator, please remember that your energy and the values that you express in your practice with your students and your pupils is what we need to see in your accounts. Now, if you look at this notion of professionalism, this is what I found when I was at the St. Martin's College. And the way I organised the talk is to just look at defining a profession, focus on what is educational, because this is really crucial, because unlike this guy that I've got a lot of respect and time for, Gert Biester, Goethe is arguing that we've got a well-developed language of learning, but we haven't got a well-developed language of education. My point is, look, the disciplines people, philosophers, psychologists, sociologists, historians, have created a well-defined language of education, but it's defined in terms of the disciplines. What we haven't got is a language of what is educational. If I ask you to explain your educational influence in the learning of your students, I think we'd need to find some of this evidence from you of that multimedia kind that can't be captured by the philosophers, psychologists, sociologists, historians. So that's why I focus on what's educational, and also try and, I hope, convince you that each one of you could be and should be producing your own, what I call your own living educational theory. And this is different from the kind of theories that I read about when I was at St. Martin's College studying the theories and educational theories of the day. I then went to study educational theory at the Institute of Education with philosophers like Richard Peters and Paul Hurst, who held that educational theory was made up of the disciplines of education. So I spent 4 years, 2 years for the philosophy of psychology, then 2 years for the Masters in Psychology, with that view that educational theory was constituted by the theories of the philosophy, psychology, sociology, and history of education. Now, why I want to really work with you today, to say, look, the pressures in the universities are still very great to make you comply and conform to that kind of language and logic in the disciplines. And I was delighted in 1983 when Paul Hurst acknowledged he'd made a mistake. And the mistake he said he'd made in educational theory was viewing the practical principles, for example, that I was going to study with them between 68 and 70. So remember that I was literally suffering from this mistake that they made, where they said that they viewed the practical principles that you and I will use to make sense of what we're doing as at best very crude and superficial pragmatic maxims. Okay? We've got that crude and superficial pragmatic maxims that in any well-developed educational theory would be replaced by principles with more theoretical justification, which meant from the philosophy, psychology, sociology, and history. Am I making sense here? That the very practical principles, the values that I use to make sense of my life and give it purpose, was, in those terms of the discipline's approach, to be replaced. Now, many of us suffered from that replacement. We were not taken seriously as professional educators that have the values that you have and that you can actually bring into your accounts of why you're doing what you're doing to explain what you're doing with your students. And I'll show you how you can access some of the more recent doctorates where, for example, the idea of love, if you brought love into your title in a university, it's highly likely that you would be looked at very strangely. Now, the very first student of mine to get love at work as the title of her doctorate, using multimedia, was able to convince the examiners of love as an academic standard of judgment. Okay, the values that she used to make sense of what she was doing. I was working in the health service with a nurse who was actually advising the government at the time, Maria Naidu, who brought a passion for compassion into her doctorate, which was an embodied expression of value and meaning, into her account. And one of the most exciting ones came from an Afro-Caribbean man called Eden Charles, building on the work that you can Google this with Nelson Mandela, talking about Ubuntu. And Ubuntu has guided Nelson Mandela's life, and he has this YouTube, there's 20 minutes, where he's talking about the idea of Ubuntu coming from a Zulu tradition, meaning I am because we are. It's a very relational commitment to the other, which in our UK and English system, with our culture, we don't tend to stress. Eden, Afro-Caribbean, rooted in Africa, brought Ubuntu as a living standard of judgment into his account. Are you okay with this? Because these are all really important if you start to develop your own living educational theory in terms of your own practice. And all I'm meaning by a living theory, as distinct from the disciplines theories, is that it's an explanation of your educational influence in your own learning, in the learning of others, and in the learning of the social formation in which you and I live. Now, this is actually all in this paper. You can access it from the web. But I'll just repeat that. that the idea that each one of you can generate your own living educational theory. I first formulated that in 1985 as a living theory, and then I was president of BERA in 88, and that was when I managed to get in the Cambridge Journal of Education the very first paper on the development of a living educational theory from questions of the kind, how do I improve what I'm doing? And I think that every one of you in this room will identify yourselves with that kind of question. If you ask yourselves, okay, well, what do I do in my classrooms? And it's almost every day you're in there, I will guarantee that you're already trying to improve the quality of your practice. It's very rare that you're feeling that everything is perfect, that you're living your values as fully as you can. And my very first lesson in 1967, East End of London, I came home, I was almost in despair. I came middle-class background, I was teaching science, I was really, it's kind of O-level science. I came into the East End, Tower Hamlets, and the kids clearly, they did not understand a word I said. I went home that night, and what I was feeling, I've got to do this better. That was number one. How do I do this better? Now, that question has remained with me all the way through my professional life. And it's been a pleasure, really, to say, well, look, how do I do this better? Now, my point is you can generate your own living theory as an explanation of your influence in that inquiry. Again, I'd like to make sense here because not all educational, what is educational, okay, it's not synonymous with learning. So, this idea of what is educational connects in with your most profoundly held values. The values that you believe contribute to the flourishing of humanity. Now, you think of learning. And this is why I agree with Gert Biesti. He says, look, we've got a well-developed language of learning, but we're having a conversation next week in France to look at what is the nature of what is educational. Because I was born in 1944. My dad gave me the Victory in Europe book. He also gave me a copy of Mein Kampf. When I got into my teens, I read. And on some of this, some of the pages you think could have been written by the most liberal educator today. The history. And then you go over the pages and it's about throwing grenades into the Jewish-owned newspapers' offices. So not all learning is educational. We've got so many examples of where, for example, kids can learn things which are clearly not educational, quite damaging to others. They can be damaging themselves. And so what I'd love you to do is to think of what are the values that you use to characterize what is educational. Now, could I ask, is that clear? Because if this distinction isn't clear, as I say, I want to really focus on that because it's right at the heart of what I've got to say. Okay? And I'll bring that into a critique of a paper and a research report you can get out, which has only been recently released from the British Education Research Association in cooperation with the RSA. And it's all about teacher education and research.
Can I ask a question?
Please.
Are you saying then that all education is underpinned by good values? Is that what?
Yeah, when I started the philosophy with Richard Peters, one of the things that stayed with me is this idea that education is a values-laden practical activity. Okay, so you then look and say, well, isn't this culturally relative? That if you'd gone into Germany in 1930s, you would be getting a sense of the values that underpin that society, literally as being anti-human and anti-humanistic. So when you and I are making the judgments of what is educational, I'm suggesting that you take time to justify the choice of the values that you're saying carry hope for the flourishing of humanity. And this seems to me to be very, very important in enhancing professionalism. Okay? Anything else before I go on? You sure?
So what would those values be that carry hope for the flourishing of humanity? And wouldn't they differ according to, like you say, which culture you happen to be in? Are you saying there's one particular set of values? Because obviously we've had recently a lot of discussion in the newspapers, in the media about British values in this country. fundamental British values, which is
yeah.
in our standards.
Yeah, and
teacher
again,
education.
I think because this is so important, we need to think about what is it that distinguishes the values that, for us, and this is where each one of us, I'm claiming, in your living theory, are producing a unique, an individual explanation of your influence. And you're going to be justifying to yourself and others the values that you claim carry hope for the flourishing of humanity. Now, you can build into, and this is in the paper as well, criteria of validity, so you can avoid criticism that the explanations you're giving are merely subjective and anecdotal. By getting a validation group, and for example, a group of, say, 6 of you here could form a validation group for each other. And in this validation group, you would present your evidence-based explanation. And your validators would have to answer questions like, how can I make this more comprehensible? Have I got sufficient evidence to back up the claims that I make? Am I showing sufficient awareness of the socio-historical and cultural influences on my practice? And this allows you to bring in an understanding of the different cultural influences on our values. And the 4th criteria is the one that's put forward by Jürgen Habermas to say, you've got to show over time and interaction that your account is authentic in the sense that you truly believe the values you claim to hold. But you can only show that over time and interaction. Now, when I did this with Peggy Koch in Singapore, because Peggy came over explicitly as an East Asian woman, and part of her analysis is what it was like to be supervised by a white Western male. My values were, and I got these from the Institute with Richard Peters and others, were about freedom and justice, consideration of interests, respect for persons, and democratic forms of evaluation. Peggy, from the Singaporean culture, said, well, look, Jack, actually, the values of Singapore focus on excellence, and they're connected with the economy. So when she actually focused in her master's dissertation, she showed how she retained this sense of excellence in what she was doing, and at the same time actually acknowledged the importance of values like respect and freedom and justice. But she did that from her own individual position. Eden Charles brought in a way that I'd never ever seen before done, this South African notion of Ubuntu as a relational commitment to the other. And again, that value has influenced many people that have actually accessed Eden's doctorate, and they've integrated this within their own narrative. But the only way I think you can ultimately, if you like, justify is to use 2 principles. One is from Michael Polanyi's personal knowledge. And Polanyi said, look, take a decision to understand the world from your point of view, as a person claiming originality and exercising judgment responsibly with universal intent. And he said his purpose was to strip away the crippling mutilations of centuries of objectivist thought. So Polanyi is saying, look, you've got an ultimate responsibility for your own values. You can take that choice. You've then got Habermas with social validity, which is, look, hold your accounts with those values for the scrutiny of others to answer those 4 kinds of questions about social validity. And yet, I haven't been able to go further than that in justifying the fundamental values I hold. And some of those, as with my students, you'll see that love and their understanding of love comes into their explanation of why they're doing what they're doing.
Jack, can I ask a question?
Please.
Should we be seeking validation from people outside of our cultural framework?
That always is very helpful. If you can have within your validation group, for example, I always try to include people from a perspective that I knew was actually quite hostile to my own. And so I had some colleagues who, for example, were positivist researchers. They were from the physics group. Now, I would ask them to come in, please, to my validation, because I always benefited from the nature of the critique that they would give. And in my early life, this was in the 1980s, they helped me to really be very clear what I was meaning by objectivity and subjectivity, what I was meaning by generalizability, reliability, validity. Now, all of that focus came from people from within a different paradigm, but it helped me to strengthen my own way of working and my own sense of knowledge by answering those critiques. So I think it's really important, if you can, not to have people that you know literally are agreeing with you, but certainly I had in all my validation groups that sense of a critical discourse. Karl Popper puts it really well. He said, look, all our judgments ultimately do have a subjective base. But what we do is we actually subject our judgments to what he called a mutual rational control of critical discussion. And that's how we strengthen the objectivity of our accounts, through intersubjective criticism. And that's where bringing in the different perspectives is, for me, it widens your own cognitive range of concern, because I've now brought in Ubuntu within my own understanding. I'd never thought of bringing compassion or even love within my own accounts, which I now do. And that's come from others. Yes?
Can I ask, how does this play out against schools, universities attempting to sort of have a collegiate ethos, so that everybody's sort of singing from the same hymn sheet, so in their approaches, in schools or universities, or because this seems to be rather atomising it slightly, so that, you know, this is my philosophy of education, this is how I want to approach it. You might have another one, you might be validated in a slightly different way.
Yeah, it's and you'll see when I show you, I'll just show you on the web, how you can access these doctorates and the masters, and each one is unique and singular. And Bakhtin says, look, our ethical problem is that we really do need to focus on what he called a radical singularity and responsibility. But even now, as I'm with you, I'm actually literally with you in a social context and partially within a shared culture. So in terms of my analysis, you'll see that I bring in these cultural awarenesses and historical awarenesses so that some sense of a shared judgment can be made. And in the examination process, for example, everybody in this room who gets a doctorate will have to, and there are only about 3 criteria that I ever use in terms of examining doctorates. Is this an original contribution to knowledge? Has a person shown that they've engaged appropriately and critically with the ideas of others? Is there material within the thesis worthy of publication, but it doesn't have to be presented in a form ready for publication? Now, those are shared. Now, a living theory, which is unique to the individual, can also show how they're meeting those shared criteria. So you've got both the individual and unique together with the shared and common. And this is a really important point in terms of that sense of influencing the culture, because that third criteria of a living theory is that you should show the nature of the influence you're having and the way in which the social formation influences you. Are you okay, or do you want to come back?
Yeah, no, at the moment.
Yeah, but that is, again, it's really important not to allow the dominant culture, which ethnography, if you use just ethnography, it gives priority to the cultural in terms of explanatory frame. If you use autoethnography, it allows you to bring the individual within the cultural, but it still gives primacy ultimately to the cultural. Now, a living theory is produced in a self-study, which is narrative. It's also ethnographic, but it allows you to explain your influence in your own learning and the learning of others, and, importantly, in the learning of the social formation in which we're living and working. But this is why I think each one of you here could serve to enhance professionalism by actually bringing your own living theory, and especially the energize and the values that you use to actually make sense of your own practice. You see, you're having an enormous influence on me now. All I see are quite passive faces in serried rows. Yet when you ask your questions, suddenly you become an alive human being to me with really interesting questions. Now, at this moment, I'm feeling actually your energy is being evoked in the way that I'm actually responding. And if I explain why I'm doing what I'm doing, I've got to bring in those values and those passions, as I believe you will have to do with your students, and possibly your colleagues. Are we okay if I just go on to show you how you can access some of these? Because you'll see all this, as I say, in the keynote on the web. But what I wanted to make sure that I covered was the resources that you've now got access to. Now, I can't get everything onto this sheet here in terms of showing you what is actually available. But let me just see if I can bring it back. I'll just put a new new window. Let me just see.
Jack,
Yeah.
while you're looking for that, you mentioned a paper that's recently been released by the RSA, but I think it then went off on a tangent.
Yeah, sure.
Would you just like to say that again?
Yeah, that I'll just see if I can bring it up for you. That the British Educational Research Association actually still supports the values of the education research community. Now, this report from BERA is called Research and the Teaching Profession, Building the Capacity for a Self-Improving Education System. Now, I've had a conversation with a former president of BERA like myself, Jeff Whittier. In his presidential address, the last paragraph, you want to access it, where Jeff is arguing for a change of name of the British Educational Research Association to change it to the British Education Research Association. Now, that's not a small change. What it does is keep the control, in Jeff's case, the sociologists, of the knowledge base. Now, this report, which is one of the most influential to come out from the educational research community, because that's what we are, but it's actually produced by education researchers. If you have a look at the steering committee, you'll see, you know, there's Ian Mentor, there's Jeff, there's John Furlong, there are others. You look at their titles, Professor of Education. My point is, when you look at the 7 academic papers that were commissioned, on which this report was based, you'll see that they're almost all located in universities. Now, I'm not attacking the universities as such. I believe that there should be these necessary connections. I hope it's obvious that I want the masters and doctor educators to be accredited both by the university and a professional body that we ourselves have to create. So if you go into the report, I've got a symposium at BERA in September, where again we'll be going into this more detail to try to argue that the British Educational Research Association should have taken account of the knowledge of the practitioner-researchers in generating this report on teacher research. So if you just have to develop, I think, this very critical approach, and it's difficult because the people that are, it's like the great and good. You know, if you look who constitutes the steering committee, these are people that have been very influential indeed in teacher education programs in universities. I don't believe one of them you'll be able to find an account on the website that explains their educational influence in their own learning or the learning of others. And yet this is the very knowledge that I'm saying we now need for us to create and actually share. Are you okay with that? Because it's a very, very important report, but to be critical of, you know, to say, well, actually, we need to go further than this. And the knowledge that we've created as educational researchers that can explain our educational influence in our own learning. But don't hesitate to come back at me because, you know, the cultural influences on us are against enhancing professionalism. In 1988, I was the BERA representative on what's called the Forum of Associations that ultimately created the General Teaching Council. John Tomlinson was in the chair. And my critique of it at the time was that John focused on the procedural elements, the procedural, and ignored completely the importance of the professional knowledge base, which I'm arguing in terms of professionalism is one of the 5 criteria you'll see at the beginning of my keynote. I just list the 4 criteria I got in 1967 when I was studying at St. Martin's College. I then add the 5th about contributing to the professional knowledge base, which everybody here can do. But at the moment, we're not actually getting our knowledge accredited as those of master and doctor educators, and we've no procedure for doing that. The government stopped. You probably know this. General Teaching Council was supposed to be our professional organisation. What did they do? For 18 months, 2000, they closed it down. Now, the fact that the government can close our professional organisation down means that we haven't fulfilled one of the criteria of a profession, which is an autonomous, self-governing organisation. Now, where do you go now to be accredited as master and doctor educators? And this is what I'm suggesting we need to work on. Because the universities have already got procedures for accrediting your master's and your doctoral degrees. Now, it doesn't take much, and I've shown at the University of Bath how this can be done. I'll show you how to access them, where you can look at the narratives of the teachers that have been accredited, in my language, as master and doctor educators. But I can't get them recognised anywhere, because we don't have a professional body. This is, when I look back at my 47 years, you know, St Martin's College, there was I, the Way to Professionalism Education, initial teacher education course, and I look back, 47 years, and we're actually in as bad a position to get our knowledge accredited as we were then. We're going backwards because they've closed it down. And this is where I think we've got such a lot of effort to put in. But there's a lot of evidence from the work that, for example, going on in RIPLE, the Practitioner-Researchers journal in higher education, which is your own in-house journal that you can actually publish your accounts in. I was talking to Pete just a little while ago. It's just about that idea of trying to extend it into multimedia work. But you've already got here in RIPLE a wonderful professional organisation that could actually support you bringing your embodied knowledge and getting it accredited. And I'll just show you how you can actually access these accounts from the teacher researchers. Now, if you go into my webpage, so as I say, it goes across the page, but on the What's New section, you'd find on the right-hand side access to the Keynote, access to the Educational Journal of Living Theories. I'll show you how you can access that. In my Keynote, you've got the URLs for the December 2013 issue. The new one is about to come out in a week. I've put the URL for that, so you'll be able to access the new issue. It's free. It's got a very good international open refereeing system. And I'm suggesting to the editorial board they start to act to recognise the knowledge of master and doctor educators. So at least we've got some organisation that can start to actually recognise us in those terms. But if you will just go onto the left-hand column of the resources, you'll see these. Living Theory Theses of Doctor Educators, Master Educators' Writings, and the pre-service. As I say, I've never seen that better. This is a booklet from Maureen Laidlaw. She's a Professor for Life at Ningxia Teachers University in China. She did amazing work. A friend of China, awarded that by the Premier of China. She's now doing some tutoring at the Open University. You go into the Master Educators Writing. All you need to do is just click on these, and you'll be able to go down. This was making public the embodied knowledge of master educators. Head teacher researcher, how can I demonstrate the impact and self-understandings? That was one of the latest ones. Authenticity as a leader. How have I developed my own personal views of gifts and talents? Can you see how the I comes into these inquiries? Now, some of the universities, even up to 2 years ago, were asking for the I to be removed from research proposals. Now, this happened to me at Kingston University in '91. They were paying the university a consultancy to enable me to support action research. That letter went to a head teacher to ask her to remove the personal pronoun from the title of her research. Now, because we were so well established at the time, we got that rescinded. You know, we pointed out to the research committee, who was quite largely made up of the engineers and the people that were used to the controlled experimental designs, and we managed to reinstate the I as being a very important, in fact, causal influence in terms of what was actually happening. So that I, please remember to put your own I within your inquiries. You know, how do I improve my practice? I've always brought in this idea of I as a living contradiction. That I'm saying, unlike most academic traditions, where contradictions are eliminated from correct thought, you, I think, will recognise yourselves as living contradictions, in the sense that you hold together passionately held values together with their negation.
Jack,
Yeah?
can I just ask, what do you mean by contradictions are eliminated from correct thought?
Well, it goes back to Aristotle's main work on interpretation. And Aristotle actually says that if you have two mutually exclusive statements, I am free, I am not free, they can't be true simultaneously. So you've got a logic which goes back to Aristotle, which is known as propositional logic, which eliminates contradiction from correct thought in the sense of theory. Do you want this battle?
But surely, in terms of when you're thinking critically, you acknowledge potential contradictions.
Yeah.
And you're trying to explore those.
Very much so.
Yeah.
So the contradictions exist in real life. Where they've got to be eliminated, according to the propositional theorists, and Karl Popper was one of the most famous, and he's got a lovely section in Conjectures and Refutations where he demonstrates if something contains a contradiction in a theory, he says it's entirely useless as a theory, because he uses Aristotle's logic to demonstrate you can prove any statement to be true if it contains a contradiction. Now, the dialecticians, led by Plato's work on poetic inspiration through the ways of Socrates, said actually we've got two ways of coming to know, and we can hold things together, both the one and the many together. So it established this notion of the dialectic, because Socrates said, anybody who can do this, I call dialecticians, and I walk as in the path of a god. You know, so there was this real tension between the feeling of contradiction and eliminating contradiction from theory. Now, could I just ask if you're okay with this, because it's a very important point. All the propositional theories of the disciplines eliminated contradictions from their theories. Yeah?
I mean, I just wondered, is there a way of moving, probably going in a slightly different direction here, but what would your view then be of something like positivism? So your theories hold across into the medical world, in the sense of into training professionals.
Yeah.
Presuming in that world, when we talk about sort of serious illnesses, although I'm sort of committed to interpretive research and so on, if I'm going to see a doctor, and when I'm ill, I'm very keen to know that the doctor's following past treatment and so on, which I'm engaged with through positivistic research, which is open to the challenge of the scientific community. I'm engaged with that. I was just wondering what would be...
Yeah, I think, again, this is really important. Can I just check with Pete? Pete, when should I stop?
Well, we want time for questions, Jack, and
okay.
so in say 3 or 5 minutes,
it's okay.
then we have a few
sure.
minutes for questions.
Yeah. Again, I would say that I've learned such a lot from positivism. My first degree was as a joint honours in physics and chemistry at the University of Durham, King's College. Yeah? Now, I'm still very influenced by issues of validity. My research in electrochemistry for 1 year was on a controlled experimental design. Now, when I go to the medical research, like you, if I'm taking a drug for whatever it is, I want to know it's been medically tested through controlled experimental designs. So I value enormously that kind of research. For example, David Hamilton, about 72, published Illuminative Evaluation. And this wasn't being facetious, he was being serious when he said, look, in the agricultural botany paradigm, if you want to improve the yield of various important foodstuffs, you use controlled experimental designs. Now, for particular purposes, positivism is really significant and important. The problem was that it became imposed on educational research. And the big difference is this. When I was doing the controlled experimental designs, I was looking for causal relationships between variables, where I had the independent and the dependent variable. I carried that on into my master's dissertation, where I used a controlled experimental design. In the department I was head of science, I could allocate at random pupils to groups. We have 3 groups, and I could carry out that research. Halfway through it, I recognised that actually I was just carrying out research to test the validity of Piaget's cognitive stage theory, Gagnet's theory of learning. What I wasn't doing was answering my question, how do I help my pupils to improve their understanding of science? At that moment, I changed my notion of research from being a positivist to actually being an interpretive researcher, and I then moved into action research and then into living theory. Because the relationships that I'm having now with you are not causal. I can't claim to have had a causal influence in any of your learning. But I can claim, if some of you use any of the kind of documents or resources I've made available to you, that I'm having an educational influence. And it's not causal. So I need a very different form of research to make that judgment that I'm having an influence with you in your learning, and you in the learning of your students. It's no less rigorous. I can demonstrate, using those criteria of validity, that it's beyond reasonable doubt, it's like a court of law, that you bring your case and it's beyond reasonable doubt that you're having the influence you claim. But it's not a controlled experimental design, and it doesn't conform to the canons of positivism. But that's not to say that positivism isn't really vital in areas where it's appropriate. It's like with statistical analysis. It took me 4 years to understand, studying statistics, that a lot of it was being used in an inappropriate way. To use parametric statistics, you've got to be able to put into a taxonomy and understand something about the intervals in the data that you're gathering. Now, if I say, look, I love my students, I love what I do, there's a compassionate work, there's an excitement over issues of justice, I can't give that 9 out of 10. But I can show you, and I did a text in my own doctorate, what it meant to have a passion for academic freedom as I encountered constraints on my academic freedom within an organisation. Are we okay with that?
Can I just ask, are you saying that alongside living theory, there is a place for positivist random control trials in education as well?
Yeah, that one of my students in Ireland, James Finnegan, his doctorate is in my living theory section. James, head of science, he used the kind of positivist data in relation to test data to create dialogue around the idea of what he needed to do to improve his practice. So it's not to eliminate appropriate data if you can use it to help you to improve your practice. That's why if you go into Creswell's notions of methodology, he says you've got to choose one of his 5 methodologies. You've got to choose one of them. And it could be ethnography, grounded theory, case study, narrative inquiry, phenomenology. My point is that you can use insights from any of those in terms of your question, how do I improve my practice? How do I explain my influence in what I'm doing? And you're generating your own original methodology. In fact, one of your former professors, Marianne Daz, put forward with Susan Hart, it's a beautiful text, I think it was about 2001, what she called methodological inventiveness. And I do advise you to get that doing practitioner-researcher differently. Because this methodological inventiveness puts the emphasis on you as a creative researcher, not to use anybody else's methodology as a total, but to draw insights from it in creating your own. Are we okay with this? Because RIPLE, as I say, I think it's got a really important role to play in enhancing professionalism in the way that I've been outlining. Sorry?
I can see the advantages of doing that, me as a creative researcher, but what concerns me is that the external constraints that we have, i.e., am I allowed to use the word Ofsted, don't.
Well, you see, if we're now talking about legitimating your embodied knowledge, yeah? Ofsted don't have a role in it. The Ofsted, you've got to acknowledge the power of Ofsted. You're in it.
Yeah.
So you look at all of the constraints that we're all living in. We can't avoid it. But if we are actually going to transcend some of those constraints by creating our professional body with our own knowledge base, this is what I'm saying. I think we've got to learn that some of the Ofsted criteria are genuinely very constraining. Yeah. That none of the Ofsted criteria will allow you to make judgments and explain what you're doing in terms of your love for education. Yeah, can you imagine Ofsted? Although one of the Ofsted reports from a school did say the children love to come to school. It's the first time it's seen love used within an Ofsted report. So what I'm suggesting is that we recognise, you don't ignore at all, these constraining pressures that we're all under. Now, I've been under all these since I started 47 years ago. In my first year's teaching, I was under the pressure, to get the kids through the exams with the best grades possible. Now, that denied some of my own scientific inquiry. But I had to do both. I had to, in the first part of the year, I really lived my values of scientific inquiry. As it got nearer the exams, there's a totally different pedagogy at work about it, isn't there? It's not to ignore this at all, it's to say, look, this is real. But Ofsted don't legitimate your professional knowledge as educators. And that's what I'm saying that we need. Now, as I say, I do hope you will access this website, because in particular, the living theories of the master and doctor educators which you can access, this is the master educators, feel to me to have already established what we need in terms of the knowledge base and the procedures for doing it. You know, they're actually in quite a number of universities now throughout the world. University of Pretoria, which is a conservative, well-established university, is now in its medical school got a living theory. University of Durban has. Nelson Mandela University. In Canada, Australia, the UK, in Ireland in particular, the University of Limerick. So I think we've now got, and you'll be able to access all of these, and I just hope they'll provide you with that kind of stimulating recognition that others are working in a way that will respect your values and that you've got a group to share them. Because ultimately, for example, as doctor educators, all you need to do is to persuade 2 people about the knowledge. Because that's all it takes to get a doctorate. Unless you're a member of staff, and then it takes 3, I think. But I think we've already got the procedures, and we've shown, as I said, the resources today, the nature of the knowledge that we can create together. But I'll just pause there. Are there any more questions before? Is there anything else? Are we okay then?
Well, let's, first of all, thank you very much, Jack. I think, colleagues, that we've got a fantastic opportunity that Jack has become an honorary professor at our university. And I mean, we do already in many of our MA and PhD theses, many of our colleagues adopt a practitioner-research approach, but within that they include a reflexive element to their work. And one example is Kaz Stewart. Many of you will know her. She works at Whitehead at the moment as a research officer. In her PhD thesis, she used graphic images and poetry throughout the PhD. It was an action research PhD with several cycles in order to communicate her the reflexive element. I must admit that towards the end, Jack, the flow of that was, tidied up into a chapter because of the, the second supervisor, whatever. But even so, that was a very important way, like your multimedia, like the power of video and so on, to try and, for Kaz to express her values and her experience and her, if you like, it was towards a living theory. Now we've got an opportunity to build capacity in the department for living theory theses, and I think it's a very exciting opportunity for us. So, has anybody got any other questions? We've got just a few minutes to ask more questions, so any hard questions for Jack?
I guess in showing us the living theories on your website, that you think that they do have some generalisability and that I'm looking at them and that's somebody else's personal theory, but I could learn something about myself or my own context from that.
Yeah, Michael Bassett put it really well in his presidential address. He talked about relatability and said that generalisability in the traditional sense of a positivist doesn't apply to the action research. Because in the traditional research, the theories are already general. They're supposed to apply to all. Again, am I making sense there? Now, a living theory is your unique explanation of your influence. And I can demonstrate how, throughout the world, people have actually taken ideas and acknowledged the influence of those in the creation of their own. So it is generalisable in a sense that it can be spread, but the acknowledged influence and the evidence of that is within each of the living theories. But it's a very different sense of generalisability to the traditional positivist or even propositional theory. So that's, again, it's learning how to respond to those really important questions, because you will get them. They'll say, but this is not generalisable. A living theory is not generalisable, or this is merely subjective. Well, when you can come back and show there's a really rigorous process of validity, it's been related to by others throughout the world, and you can show some evidence of that, which we can from that website. Any others? Any other you feel?
I've got a question, Jack. I mean, I suppose when you're starting out as a researcher, say doing your MA as a teacher or starting your doctorate, I guess there is a feeling that in order to get your research accepted, you have to conform to definitions by people like BERA or the research audit and so on. you sort of feel that you've got to comply in a way, and so like it takes someone brave like Kaz to put poetry into a record. So can you tell us about what you feel about that?
Yeah, in my experience, it did initially take quite a bit of courage to do this. So like Kaz, what would be nice is if we find that can be made available to you on the web. Do you see? Because you've got somebody who has actually put forward one for the first time, for example, in this context. Now, all you need, and you do need, some kind of supervision that is supportive of what you're doing. And that's the crucial thing, that you get a supervisor who will actually enable you to do this kind of work. Now, the other thing are the examiners, that you just make sure that you've got people that are actually sympathetic to the perspective. You don't, early on, I mean, I've still got letters from Senate which state, literally, you can't do research, you haven't shown satisfaction in the teaching of prescribed courses, and you've disturbed the good order and morale of the whole School of Education. Now, I've got that framed, I've still got that framed. And it was where they were refusing to give me a 10-year contract. Now, this was because they didn't recognise the research I was doing just as legitimate. Now, I was very lucky that people around the world, or people like David Hamilton, Michael Young, I didn't know these well, but they wrote supporting the research I was doing. And then a professor of public law from the LSE, John Griffiths, just went through the university like a knife through butter, and in 1973 they had to give me this, it was 76 actually, a 10-year contract till 2009. So that's why I've been able to do this work, because my job was protected. But early on, it did take a bit of courage to pursue it, because, as Peter is saying, the constraints of the traditional system can be quite worrying. But it's now accepted around the world. Yeah, sorry.
Last question then.
Okay, thank you. Given the convivial nature of learning, have you any thoughts on the opportunities for collaborative doctorates?
Yeah, on the web, on the right-hand side of my website, you'll see there is a collaborative project, an international one on CPD. Now, the only problem when it comes to judging these, and the School of Independent Study that used to be at one of the polytechnics in London, I was an examiner for it, and this was always a question about how do you make an individual judgment when the work has been collaborative. And we genuinely have not yet sorted that out. That we've got collaborative inquiries, so we've got one or two theses which are explicitly collaborative inquiries, and John Herron and Peter Reason have focused in on that. But it still comes down to, unfortunately, in one sense, an individual judgment, because it's the individual who receives the degree, not the group. So that is still a very important question, especially in relation to this notion of Ubuntu. I am because we are. And I've only been able to do what I have done through the influence with others. And yet, in my doctorate, I've got the doctorate. So I think that's one question to try and pursue. But I think that might just be pushing the boundaries at the present time too far.
I sit and listen to it, and lucky being my background was engineering, and in manufacturing and business there's a procedure called Kaizen, which is the idea that you change an organisation incrementally, and people change incrementally, lots of small incremental changes, rather than turning the world upside down. And it looks to me like what you're saying is kind of slightly aligned with that. You don't have to turn the world upside down, it's ongoing. All right?
No, it's really, again, very, very important, because a lot of the sociologists, quite often influenced by Marxism in the 70s and 80s, had the view that if you adopted a critical theory of society, you had to change the macroscopic power relations almost before you could do everything on an individual site. Now, creating your own living theory actually works from the ground. You're going to improve your practice, but you are going to show that you're having some influence on social formations.
Very much so.
Okay, so Jack, you've given us a lot to think about. We like radical, we like someone having a go at the establishment, and we really valued your thought-provoking talk, so thank you very much indeed.